Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you for listening. I hope this show is something that you'll look forward to checking in with every week. Whether you're a beginner or an expert, Gardening Utah aims to inspire you and keep you in the know of what tasks you should be accomplishing in your yard and meet amazing, informative experts along the way. This show airs on the radio on the weekends here in Utah at 10 a.m. on 860 AM KKAT, and episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, so hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. On today's show, we are going to go over the top mistakes that people make when starting seeds indoors. It is that time of year. Well, not quite, but it is getting close, and it is definitely time to start buying those seeds if you decide to start them indoors. And it's one of the things that I personally anticipate most out of gardening is, it's been freezing all winter, and just getting that seed catalog in the mail or seeing that beautiful row of seeds in the store is like so inspiring, and you just want to buy every single one. So today's show is going to kind of help you realize what seeds should you buy to start now, which ones can you wait till later, and how are you really going to utilize these plants. And I'm going to make sure that you don't make some of the most common and some of the most uncommon mistakes when you are planting your seeds indoors, because I see it a lot in the garden groups and through questions to my Instagram. And just the other day, I saw a post where someone had started some sunflower seeds indoors, and they're in the garden center. So you think, hey, let's start some sunflowers. But it's just way, 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 way too early, and they're just not going to survive being planted indoors unless they have the absolute perfect conditions. So we're going to tackle all of that in today's show. Now, speaking of garden questions, we may get to some of those as well, depending on how much we talk about starting seeds indoors. So since the season is getting closer and closer, my Instagram for Gardening Utah is starting to heat up like crazy with questions. And that's completely fine. I may not necessarily get to them over Instagram, but I will definitely make an effort to kind of aggregate some of the most common questions and get to them on the show. But here's kind of a new thing, ladies and gentlemen. If you would like to actually be on the show, meaning if you would like to hear your voice on this podcast and on the radio, and you want to ask a garden question, here is what you can do. You can go to the Gardening Utah Instagram. So just open Instagram, go to Gardening Utah, and this will need to be over a mobile phone. And then send me a direct message and then click the audio button. So send me a message by utilizing the audio, record your voice asking the question. And I'm going to assume if you've done that you've given me the approval to put that question on the air. So I'm going to take that audio file, plant it right here in my show, and we will be answering those questions for you. And I'll, of course, message you back and say, yay, you made the podcast. So I can't guarantee we're going to get to all of them. Of course, it depends on how many, and it depends on, what guests I have different weeks. But again, I think this would be a fun way to incorporate some of your questions in the show, and I cannot wait to hear your questions. Okay, so who's going to be starting seeds indoors? I can't wait to help you prevent some of the most common mistakes. So we're going to get into that after this. But first, the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is 2 things to consider when you bring home brand new indoor houseplants. Okay, so let's envision you're at the garden center. You find these beautiful plants that you have the perfect vision of where they're going to be in your living room or dining room, where they are getting this beautiful bright light. Well, when you bring those plants home, do not put them directly in their future spot if there is direct sunlight. You may find if you've done this in the past, you'll think back and realize, I brought that home from the garden center, but it just started to burn on the edges of the leaves. It started to yellow, and I just really didn't have luck at first. Well, that's probably because the plant got a little bit of shock from suddenly getting direct sunlight. And if you think about it, these plants for their entire life have been grown under shade cloth. So when we bring them back to where its future environment is going to be, it is not used to getting direct sunlight onto the leaves. So the best thing to do is start to acclimate it slowly to the place that it will live in the future, assuming it does have direct sunlight. So keep it in a shady spot in your home. Watch the watering. You don't necessarily need to water that plant straight away if the roots are already moist. You kind of just want to wait and see when the top of that soil starts to dry out, and then you can water it. But again, we really need to kind of harden off that plant. Think about it really similar to if you've grown your vegetable seeds indoors and you're going to go put those outside when the last frost has finished. Well, look, you always do a hardening off process with those plants so that they can get used to the direct sunlight. And this is a very same scenario. So again, first tip is don't put the plant directly in the sunlight when you bring it home from the garden center. Just let it acclimate into a shady place and slowly integrate it over weeks into the spot that does have that sunlight, or wherever it is you're going to put it in the future. Tip number 2 is you also need to consider your other houseplants. What you never want to do is bring a houseplant home from a garden center or anywhere, maybe you're trading with a friend, and then put it with all of your other plants. That plant needs to be in sort of what I call plant quarantine, because what you don't want is maybe it has spider mites or gnats or something that you can't really see with the eye. You don't want to immediately put that plant with your other houseplants because it may spread that disease or the bugs to your other plants. So give it some time, make sure there's no problems, keep it away from your other houseplants, just to be sure that you're not spreading disease to any of your other plants.
And that's your Gardening Utah Tip of the Week, brought to you by the Advocates. If you're in an accident, you deserve an advocate. Call 801-355-5550 or visit utahadvocates.com. Never miss a tip for your garden and never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
I always get a little bit humbled by that music. It's like, it really sets me up as being, there's a lot of pressure with all of those sound bites about me. My goodness. Anyway, I'll try to live up to the hype. Okay, let's talk about the mistakes to avoid when starting your seeds indoors. This is one of my very favorite topics to talk about ever, because I've started my seeds indoors for as long as I can remember. And it's just one of those things I look so forward to every year. And it's so fun for me to watch that very first germination when the seeds just barely start to poke out. And I swear I check on my seeds 2 to 3 times a day just because it's so fun to know, like, hey, I grew that, that's doing that because of what I'm creating here. And then, getting those seeds put out into the garden. Oh my goodness. Of course, when it's time after the last frost has passed, but it's one of the massive joys of being a gardener. And I know I sound like a total garden geek, but I know I'm in good company because you're only listening to the show because you're into gardening, right? So you can relate to me, I'm sure. And, I'm sitting here in my office where I record this show, and I'm looking at the Baker Creek catalog, which I'm ready to make a purchase from. I'm looking at the Burpee catalog. I've got the True Leaf website up in one of my browsers. And so I'm doing some serious seed shopping this year. Now, for me, I have a little bit different of a philosophy than a lot of people that do start their seeds. Seed starting indoors, take it from me, is not overly easy. There are a lot of things that can go wrong, and hopefully today I'll teach you a lot of those. But I have found that for me, it is best to only start the seeds indoors that I'm not going to find that plant in the garden center. And what I'm talking about, and this is just my opinion, and this is what I do for me, but I'm not going to start a celebrity tomato indoors. I'm not going to start a better boy or an early girl or a jalapeno pepper. Well, actually, I'm guilty as charged with that because I do have a packet of Craig's Grand seeds that I need to get through. But that being said, I really don't like to plant those things that you can easily pick up when they're for sale in the garden centers. So I'm kind of going for your rare tomatoes like the Goldsman Italian or San Marzano. I know that that's getting a little more popular nowadays, which is awesome. But I try to only start the seeds that I just can't find anywhere else. And that for me is what works, because if I really wanted to do a full, all of the plants that I'm going to plant outside, I grow myself indoors, I'm going to need to invest in a lot more equipment, a lot more shelving, a lot more lights, and a lot more, indoor potting soil, seed starter, heat mats, the whole works. So I'm just not willing to go there. So I know exactly how much space I have. And I know that I want all the rare tomatoes, all the rare peppers, and all the rare, Snapdragon colors. And I could go on with the things that I start indoors. But in general, I really only do, like I said, those things I can't buy anywhere else. So let's start into the biggest consideration that you need to think about when starting seeds indoors. And that is, do you really need to start them indoors? And you may think, okay, well, what do you mean? Don't we want to start seeds indoors so that we get a lead out on the season? Well, that is the number one reason I think, one of the big considerations as to whether or not you do want to start your seeds indoors is you're getting a head start on the season, and maybe your tomatoes are the same size as they are in the garden center when they go for sale in the garden center, and that's fine. However, not all seeds need to be planted indoors to get that head start. In fact, many of them you do not want to start indoors. And I'm talking about, let's just start with root vegetables. Never, ever, ever plant your beets, your carrot, radishes, any root vegetable. No root vegetable needs to or should be ever planted indoors. Those can be direct sown outside, and they will grow much, much better every single time when they're direct sown in the. In fact, the other vegetables that you really never want to plant indoors is peas. I know you will find those sometimes for sale in the garden center, but they really do not transplant well. And as you can probably see when you have seen them in those 6-packs at the store, their little tendrils have already sort of curled all around each other and they're impossible to separate. It is not a good start to the world when you plant peas indoors. Just start them outside. They can handle cold. I mean, a little too soon right now, but around, in most areas of Utah, particularly northern, around St. Patrick's Day, get those peas in the ground. Of course, St. George and anything, in the south is much different. In fact, you could probably get peas going right now, and many of you probably already have. But direct sow your peas. And look, squash, pumpkins, melons, it is so tempting to get those started indoors. I've done it myself many times. It's so tempting with your squash and pumpkins and melons because you think you're going to be getting a leg up on the growing season if you just get those going 6 weeks in advance. But I actually did a test last year because I'm guilty as charged. I've always started my watermelons, not zucchinis, because those grow too freaking fast. But I've always started my watermelons and my larger squash like pumpkins and Hubbard and butternut. I could go on for all the different, I plant lots of different squash, as many of you hardcore Gardening Utah listeners know. But last year I did a little bit of a test. I started a small bit of squash indoors about 6 weeks before the last frost date, which in many areas of Utah is around Mother's Day. And then I direct sowed the same exact seed at the planting time. So meaning like after the last frost. So I've got this maybe 3-4 inch plant, and then I've got a seed. And I saw absolutely no difference. Now, this is just my own personal science, folks. This is not like a USU extension, report. This is just me saying I saw no difference in harvest time from the squash that I started indoors to the squash that I direct sowed into the ground. Now, that may vary from location and timing, but all I'm really trying to say is those vegetables don't like to be transplanted well. And they go through a little bit of transplant shock when you put them in the ground. Now, let's not even start with the fact that you have to harden them off perfectly so they don't get any sunburn. And, the list goes on and on with the things you need to do. But they go through that little bit of a shock, and then it can end up getting harvested at the exact same time. Now, that's just for a lot of these vegetables. Some vegetables transplant amazing, like many of your bedding flowers and tomatoes, peppers. There's just, you can see a ton of success with a lot of the right plants, but in many cases, it's just not a good idea. So again, I'm just going to read a few of those in case you're trying to catch up with me here. So no root vegetables, no carrots, radishes, beets, anything like that. No corn. Corn grows so fast, guys. Put it in the ground. It will survive much better if you direct sow it into the ground where it's going to live out the rest of its days and be harvested in the fall. And again, squash, pumpkins, melons, the jury's out if that is going to actually give you a leg up on the harvest, right? Because it doesn't really matter how tall our plants are. We're really just trying to get a leg up on when we get our very first fresh vegetable out of the ground. I mean, trust me, that's like the best day in the world. But again, in some of these different varieties, the jury's out as to whether or not it helps. Now, another plant that I see people start indoors all the time, a lot of times for kids projects, because it is such a great seed that sprouts out super quickly and grows really fast, is sunflowers. But sunflowers do not love to be transplanted either. They just don't. Those roots grow so quickly, and unless you have a really large pot that you're growing them in, they are only going to be able to, just maybe 2 weeks-ish before whatever container you've put them in, the roots aren't, already starting to circle around. So really, sunflowers are not advisable to start indoors. They do just as good outside, direct sown, where it is you want them. So back to our original consideration, and a mistake that we see a lot of gardeners make is, do you really need to plant that particular seed indoors at all? So those are the main things you want to consider. Should the plant be direct sown into the ground? And how much of a leg up am I really trying to get on this growing season? And will it make a difference? And the plants I just mentioned, and there's hundreds more, by the way, but the plants I just mentioned are ones that are probably the most commonly grown that you really should just get outside. So think about that when you're doing that. And also the number one way to prevent making a mistake there is read the seed packet. If it tells you to direct sow outdoors, it really means it. It's trying to do it inside and cheating science, unless you're maybe Liz Hamilton or Malia Hokie, who are, amazing gardeners. We just might not have the same kind of luck as them. And of course, all the exceptions are there. If you have a greenhouse, if you've been an experienced gardener for so long, lots and lots of exceptions, but I'm just talking about, the general rule here. Okay, now let's talk about timing. Honestly, one of the largest mistakes that most newer indoor gardeners make is planting too early. I cannot tell you how crucial it is to read the back of the seed packet. I mean, honestly, if it tells you that your tomato needs to be planted 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost date, then that really means that. And starting it now or in the end of February, unless you have a way to put the tomatoes in a cold frame, or you have a greenhouse, or you're putting them in a wall of water, you're not going to want to start your tomatoes until 6 to 8 weeks before whatever your last frost date is. And one of the main reasons for that is you don't want those plants to get root bound. Starting too early will leave you with overgrown, root bound seedlings when it's time to get those planted, and they'll go through quite a bit of transplant shock when you do get them in the ground if they're root bound, and they just will not grow at the same rate. And at that point, you may as well have started them outdoors because they will be able to establish faster. And again, seed packet instructions are key here. And it really makes sense to follow them because, again, that's also preventing you from getting plants that are too root bound. That being said, this isn't one of my top mistakes to make, but make sure that whatever you're planting your seeds in is big enough to accommodate those roots. There are some they look like plugs. They're like a big sort of rectangle with 72 squares. I'm guilty as charged of planting in these. I've done it for a couple years with my peppers, but you need to know that I'm paying attention to those roots at all times to make sure that when they just barely start extending out, those peppers go in the ground. Because if you start those too early and they don't have enough space, you're going to have to repot them before you're ready to put them outside, and nobody has time for that. So this is one of my personal goals this year, and maybe we should all make the pact. I'm not going to plant anything inside that I don't have a 3-inch pot for. And those are much bigger than the Jiffy pots and the other containers that they sell as seed starting kits, to be honest with you. I'm not going to use any of those this year. That is my goal. I've been recycling and saving all of the, when you buy, let's say, a pack of zinnias or, some pansies, I always save the plastic that they're grown in and save those for seed starting. And this year, I'm not going to plant anything smaller than that. So I know for sure that my plant is going to have much healthier roots that have much more room to spread out. They're not going to be root bound, and they will go through a lot less transplant shock. Now, the thing I need to consider in that case, though, is I'm going to need a lot more room, and I'm going to need to start a lot less indoors because I won't have the same space that I've had in the past. And one of the reasons for those tiny little seed packets or, those seed trays is so that you can pack a whole lot of seeds into a small space. But at the end of the day, unless you're going to be able to get them outside at the exact time before those roots start to extend out through the bottom, then you're not going to have the best start to the plants. And that's kind of the whole goal with getting them going in the first place. So again, it's just a timing thing. Make sure that you're not starting your seeds too early. It's just too stressful on the plant overall. And look, another consideration, you'll see, oh, wow, my tomato's already getting a flower on it inside. That's what you don't want. You never want any of the vegetables, especially that you're starting indoors, to ever start to flower by the time you put them outside, unless they're in like gallon pots. You don't want to see that happening. And if you notice, sometimes you'll see this at the garden centers where they're purposely, selling tomatoes, peppers that already have blossoms and in many cases fruit on them, but you have to consider they're in massive, massive containers or, just much larger root systems than what you start your normal seeds indoors with. All right, another very common seed starting mistake is providing too little light. I've talked about it before in my show on a tip of the week where you'll see a lot of people starting their seeds just inside by a window, and I can promise you that there is no possible way that that window is going to provide enough light for those plants to grow. Natural light via sunny windows are just not enough to get healthy seedlings indoors, especially in the winter. And without adequate light, you'll find those seedlings grow super tall. They get very weak stems, they get leggy, and they stretch toward the light. In fact, the thing about plants and sun, right, is that sun can go to the plant or it can go to the sunlight, right? If you think about it, if the plant can't find sun, it's going to stretch to wherever it feels the most light coming from. But yeah, it's just not, you really need to have grow lights if you're going to be growing successful crops indoors. And you need to be giving those at least 12 to 14 and sometimes even 18 hours, depending on the plant, of really strong, bright light every single day. Now, the proper grow lights, I'm not going to get into that too much because there's a big science behind it. And as long as you buy the correct ones at the store, that you're going to have success. But you really need to make sure it has lumens and Kelvin. And I'm not going to get too much into the science here because that could be a completely different show. But you can also look for grow lights that are just labeled as full spectrum, meaning it emits lights across the full color spectrum. And as a general rule, choose a full spectrum grow light that has a color temperature in the blue range, which is like you want it to be around 5,000 to 7,000 K to promote like good vegetative growth, and then choose a color temperature in the red range at about 3,500 to 4,500, and that is what promotes the fruiting and the flowering. It is time to jump into a quick break, but we will be right back after this with more seed starting mistakes to avoid right here on Gardening Utah. Don't go anywhere.
860 KKAT with Jana Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I am your fearless host, Jana Francis. And with me today is myself. I really wanted to put this episode together this year because I do get so many questions on seed starting, and it's one of the things that, again, as I said earlier, it's one of my very favorite things to do as a gardener, and it's just one of those practice makes perfect things, and I'm really passionate about helping people do it right and avoid mistakes. I really want to make sure that I save you the time and the trouble and the hassle of failing and the money, right? I mean, last week's episode was all about saving money, and this is kind of a very similar theme if you think about it, like, don't do this, right? Instead of saying do this instead, it's more like, okay, just don't do it like this. And a lot of times that's how we learn as humans. And for me, I mean, I've probably, well, I'm not going to tell you how many years I've started my seeds indoors because that would age me terribly. But but I have learned from trial and error and from failing myself. And you look so forward to the plants that you're going to start indoors that it's so defeating when you fail. And I don't want that to happen to any of you, okay? But then when you win and you grow these amazing seeds and you start them outdoors after being indoors and they do phenomenal, it is so rewarding when it goes well. And most often it does if you follow very simple practices. So anyway, that being said, that's what we're trying to accomplish today for you here on Gardening Utah. And believe it or not, this is episode 67. So, wow, I think when we get to 100, we should have a party. We'll do it at somebody's nursery or at Progressive Plants or something and have a big meet and greet and a big party. I think that would be fun. I mean, I see other podcasts celebrate their 100th episode, so we should probably celebrate this one, right? I mean, I realize we've got a ways to go. But when I started the show, I don't think I ever realized like what it would look like, you know, this many years in and at episode 67. Kind of crazy, but I digress. Let's get back into the common seed starting mistakes to avoid. Now, we've already covered starting at the wrong time. We've got to make sure that we really time out with our last frost date and when that plant can go outside and just reverse engineer it, rewind the weeks based on what the seed packet says and plant at that time. Also, we talked about, making sure don't ignore those planting instructions. Really read your seed packets. They give you all the important information, like how deep to plant the seeds, what preferred growing conditions they have, and whether or not to direct sow those into the ground, or if it's okay to start earlier indoors. And we went over that a very common mistake is providing too little light, and obviously grow lights are best, and we talked about that as well. But now let's get into the soil. What are we going to be putting these seeds in when we get them started? First off, believe it or not, a common mistake I have seen is people using soil from the garden. Now look, you just can't do that. Old soil from the garden will not only introduce pests and disease, but it's just too dense for little containers like that and it will reduce germination. It does not give the roots what it needs when it's inside a container like that. Inside the ground, fine, but not inside containers. So obviously garden soil is a big fat no. And also you kind of want to avoid potting soil as well. Potting soil really, as we all know, is really just potting mix. It's usually a mix of perlite and vermiculite and coir and things like that. But the bagged normal potting soil just is not ideal for seed starting. Seeds need very light, fluffy soil in order to sprout easily. And what we're really going for is the most germination possible. You really don't want to lose seeds in the germination process. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that you're using a fresh, sterile soil medium made for seed sprouting. And they do have those bags. I know Jiffy has one called Seed Starting Mix. And to be honest, that's the one that I typically use. But you can also create your own. You can use equal parts peat moss and coconut coir. Peat moss is a great starter as long as it's mixed with other things. So peat moss, coconut coir, I think they call it cocoa coir now. Fine perlite and worm castings would be a great way to mix those together to start your seeds with. Or like I said, I just buy the bag because again, I'm trying to not start as many as possible indoors so that I give them the best start possible outdoors. But as long as it says seed starting mix, you're going to be okay. Just avoid, like I said, no garden soil and no potting soil as well. I am very guilty sometimes of being too cheap and just trying to use the potting soil, and I never, ever have the same results. So science, I'm telling you what. Okay. So another area where you can make a mistake is not providing warmth. Now, it is really important, and I found this out in the last 2 years of starting seeds. It is really important to use a seedling heat mat to promote quick and even germination. Think about it. Most seedlings require soil temperatures of being 70 to 80 degrees to even sprout, as it were. Now, that's the exception is root vegetables, of course, or any cold winter crop that you can put directly in the soil, like peas. And the vegetables that I mentioned earlier, they're going to be fine and they will germinate eventually. But most of our seeds are going to need 70 to 80 degrees just to sprout up. And it takes a long, long time if you don't have that heat mat underneath, creating that extra warmth. Cold soil really reduces germination, and it really also kind of delays a strong and healthy start. Now, once the plant germinates and it starts to grow, you don't need as much heat for that healthy start. So remove or reduce that heat after the germination, because too much heat can make the seedlings grow tall, weak, and skinny, leggy, if you will, just like really low light conditions. And I'm going to put a link to the heat mats that I use in the episode notes so that you can kind of see what they look like. And if you don't have any, I suggest if you are going to start seeds every year, it's a worthy investment because it's one of those things you buy it once and then you get the benefit every single year ahead. And I noticed a huge difference when I invested in heat mats in the germination rate, or the germ rate, as some of the experts would say, and had just a lot more success overall with getting my seeds started. All right, here's a biggie, and this might be the biggest one, and I know I've said that about every single thing. See, it's a very symbiotic relationship. We have to be good at everything as gardeners, right? So here we're at watering. Watering too much or too little is a very big determination on how successful we're going to be with our indoor seeds. So first of all, when you very first go to start your seeds, make sure to pre-moisten the seed starting soil. So we talked about that a bit ago. And what I do is I put water right inside the bag and I let it sit for a while, because sometimes those bags of, seed starting mix, or this happens a lot with potting mix as well, I find, but you don't know how long they've been sitting there and, at the garden center, and a lot of the moisture may have evaporated out of that bag. So I like to put water directly into the bag and just let it sit for a while, because it might be a little bit hydroponic, meaning it's not even absorbing anything at all. So I like to let it sit and get it nice and damp and not even start my project until that soil is workable. So put my hand in the soil, and if you can grab it with your hands and make a clump and it kind of sticks into, sort of a ball, then that's when it's ready to go. And that's when I will fill my individual seed pots from there. Now, since that soil is already damp, all you really need to do once you plant your seeds is to just gently mist the top. But the key is to make sure that you're trapping in the moisture with a humidity dome. So most of these planters that you get do have a top that goes over them. For me, like I mentioned, this year, I'm doing something a little different. So I'm going to be making sure to cover with some kind of a plastic container over the top, or maybe saran wrap. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that I trap in the humidity at least until the seed starts to sprout, because you may not want that dome to continue on providing that humidity after they sprout. In fact, most often you don't. And then you have to remember to check on them. Really, you've put in so much effort already, and the saddest thing is when you actually forget to keep that soil humid and damp, and you forget about it and it dries out, and maybe the seeds started to partially germinate and then stop. So again, a huge mistake that we can make is, forgetting about it. Do what I do, set an alarm on my phone, check plants. And I do have to do that. You get busy, right? We all do. So we just have to make sure to go check and see, keep that soil damp. Then on the magical day that you do start to see those sprouts, which, as we've talked earlier, is literally one of the best days as gardeners, we do want to then switch to bottom watering. So in this case, you only want to add enough water that they soak it all up within a few hours. You never want, even if the roots haven't gone down that far, you never want your pots to be sitting in water that creates mold conditions. It's just not good for, anything at all. You're really going to just want to, bottom water and only add enough water. They soak it up in a few hours. And then keep an eye on those plants because you only want to water them when the soil is starting to dry out some. But you never want to let it fully dry out. You never ever want them to fully dry, but you kind of want to aim for a consistently damp texture to those plants. So we've put a lot of work in at this point. We've got to make sure we keep it consistent, and it does require checking on it all the time, unless you have a beautiful greenhouse where it's got an auto waterer. So that pretty much tackles watering. So another common mistake is fertilizing. A lot of times we fertilize way too early. And look, young seedlings need little to no fertilizer. The seeds themselves contain the nutrients they need to start. You really only want to fertilize until that plant has developed a few sets of true leaves. And they still need to be a few weeks, just barely a few weeks away from being transplanted outside. Because remember, if we add that fertilizer, it's going to encourage growth. And we really only want to do that when it's getting close to being able to be transplanted outside. And I don't fertilize. But if you choose to, you're more than welcome to. I suggest maybe using a really gentle and diluted liquid fertilizer is probably the best way to go. Like maybe fish emulsion or seaweed extract, or maybe just a low nutrient fertilizer that's really diluted. You can see just as good success with, that kind of a mix. Anyway, fertilizer is a very personal choice, and it really does give your plants a leg up. There's no doubt. You just have to make sure you're doing it at the right time and you're not speeding up too much growth before you get those plants outside. I tend to wait for a week or two after I've transplanted my plants outside. Give them a little minute to get established and get the roots going into the soil that they're going to live in, and then I fertilize. But most experts would tell you the opposite, to really start giving it a balanced, light fertilizer as soon as they've developed their first few sets of true leaves. Okay, so let's talk about how many seeds to start in each individual cell or pot. This is yet another very personal choice. I have this weird thing about thinning seedlings. So saying, for example, you wanted to make sure that each little, cell or pot had a lot of seedlings coming up in it to make sure you have a good germination rate. You do need to thin those out. And I don't have the heart for that. I just don't. And then I feel like I wasted the seed and I killed it for its future life. I know I'm extremely strange. However, it's a personal choice. Like I said, I personally just put 1 or 2 seedlings in each one and I watch it. And if I'm not going to get germination, I add another one. That's a little too much maintenance. Most people that are normal will put several seedlings in each cell or pot, and then they thin them out, because really, when you do plant too many, those seedlings compete for nutrients, they compete for root space, water, airflow, and then they tend to grow more slowly if they're too packed together. So you really want to think about, how many you want per cell or pot, because letting those seedlings just grow too large when they're too compacted together in a small container, they'll get root bound, they'll get stunted growth, and quite often very permanently. So you want to make sure if you do plant a lot of seeds per cell or pot, you've got to very early on trim out excess seedlings. You kind of just go in there with scissors and, butcher the ones that aren't as healthy as the other ones. So you pick kind of the best 1 or 2 and let the other ones go. And sometimes, depending on what you've grown, you can, I know if it's like broccoli or some other lettuce and that kind of thing, those are perfectly edible, healthy little sprouts. But you really want to wait to do that until they grow their first set of true leaves, and you want to cut it down to 1, maybe 2, depending on the size pot that you have, mostly just 1. And at this stage of growing, if you have started in maybe those tiny little cell packs, if you've already gotten to the thinning process, it is now time to pot up those seedlings into a larger container or transplant them outside if they're ready when those roots are starting to poke through the bottom holes of that cell. Which leads us to the very last mistake that I'm going to go through today in this episode is hardening off. So I talked about that a little bit earlier in the tip of the week with hardening off those indoor plants, meaning don't grab them from the garden center where they've always been under shade cloth their whole life and then bring them home and put them into a massive sunny window. Same thing in this case. These seedlings have only been grown under a grow light and they cannot go out into direct sunlight without getting sunburned. It will happen. Plants can get sunburned. Can you believe it? It's weird to think they can get sunburned, but they do, and it will scorch those leaves. And in some cases, if it's like a really hot day or you just never know, it can really damage them a lot. So hardening off is so key. Now, here's how to do it. 1 week before you plan on planting those plants outside is when you want to start the process. And the goal is to create gradual exposure to outdoor conditions, which include sun, wind, rain, and temperatures. I mean, think about it. Unless you had a fan going inside your seed area, which quite often is recommended, that plant has never felt the movement of wind before. So you really need to gradually expose them to these elements to prevent shock or damage of just simply setting them outside. So a week before transplanting, just start to bring your seedlings outside in the shade for about 2 hours a day and just gradually start to expose them to, like I said, sunlight, wind, rain. I mean, obviously nothing too extreme, but you need to do it in stages and get them used to what it's going to be like to be outside. And then just gradually increase that timing every single day, of course, starting in the shade, but then slowly starting to move it out into sunlight and just do a little bit more every day. And within a week, those plants are going to be ready to get in the ground, and good job. It's such a rewarding day when you're finally getting all of the plants that you worked so hard to start from seed into the ground, and it's almost as rewarding as harvest. You know, as soon as you see that first pepper or that first flower. I mean, quite often we're not planting vegetables at all indoors. It's flowers, rare varieties or fun varieties of pansies and snapdragons and petunias and all the beautiful, beautiful things. I just cannot wait for spring. Now, what happens if you don't harden off your plants, or if you're just too anxious and you want to get those out in the garden? Just trust me, you can create some transplant shock. I mean, if the seeds haven't, or the plants haven't been adequately exposed to all these conditions, they can bend, they can snap, they may wilt, they can fry, and, worse off, obviously die. And then all of your time is completely wasted. And what happens if there's, Utah's famous for this, like a big windstorm or a really bad hailstorm. I mean, that'll just be really bad for plants anyway, but if they're not hardened off, it could be even worse. And because if you think about it, up to this point, your indoor seedlings have been so babied. They've been protected from all of the elements this whole time, and they haven't been exposed to temperature swings, even the difference between daytime and nighttime. It's been consistent for the most part, depending on where they are. They haven't experienced strong winds or anything like that. So if you take them from these really stable, normal conditions and you suddenly put them out in the elements, they can get really easily damaged. So it really makes sense, and it's just to protect your investment of time as well. And it's really easy to do, and it prevents that transplant shock. And really, it's just a little bit of insurance to provide our plants with an easier, time to get out there into the garden. Now, earlier when I mentioned a fan, what I mean is like an oscillating fan. A fan on your seedlings is a good practice in general because the increased airflow will reduce the chances of disease and dampening off even earlier on in the seedling stage. You don't want it blasting on the plants, but a couple days a week, a few hours at a time can really help get those seedlings to be stronger and get them ready for what they're about to face. Well, I hope that you learned something today. I hope you're inspired to start your seeds indoors or not, whatever's best for you. I've had a lot of fun kind of thinking about this. It's actually helped me get my mind around what it is I'm going to be doing this year and what makes the most sense. And of course, I will be looking at my seed packet and thinking about when my last frost date is going to be, and I will be going backwards in time based on how many weeks the seed packet says to grow. And that's when I'm going to start my seeds, because I do not want to, even though it's kind of fun and tempting to get a leg up, it just doesn't make sense for the plants. Again, unless you've got a greenhouse, unless you've got a cold frame, or unless you are an absolute expert gardener, or unless you've got maybe some wall of water, that kind of a thing. And as I said earlier, it's not vital to have a successful garden to start your seeds indoors. You know, you can direct sow into the garden for so many of the seeds and have just as much success as you would if you would have started them indoors. So here's my challenge to you. If you start seeds indoors, I want you to tag Gardening Utah. So if you're going to post them on your Instagram or your Facebook, tag us. I want to see what you've started. I want to watch your progress. I'm going to repost you onto our stories, and we'll have a lot of fun with it. So keep an eye on the Gardening Utah Instagram, because when I start my seeds, I'll make sure to bring you guys along with me as well. I'll show you the seeds I've planted and kind of my little setup that I have at my house. I use the Gorilla Rack from Costco. So that, sort of silver multi-tiered rack, and I have it on wheels, and that makes it really handy to kind of move around to get closer to like plugs, because I need those for my grow lights and my heat mats. So I'll keep you guys in the know when I start my seeds, and I want you to tag me if you decide to post yours, and I'll repost those to my stories. I've had so much fun today, and I hope that you have a very successful growing season. I hope that you have such good luck with germination, and I hope that all of your seedlings grow into beautiful, amazing plants, and that all your garden wishes come true. We'll see you next week here on Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, signing out. Thanks for listening.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah. Available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.